Iwakura Aria was Mages' first brand new visual novel IP in several years, a game that I'd been following and eagerly awaiting to play since the day it was announced. And after 14 months since its Japanese launch, it has now finally been released in English by PQube. But having played it for myself now, I have a lot to say about the game, both positive and negative. For those of you unfamiliar with Iwakura Aria, it is a GL suspense visual novel that follows a 16-year-old girl named Ichiko who gets hired as a live-in maid by the incredibly affluent Iwakura family. And while they're at their mansion, she immediately finds herself entranced by the young lady of the house, Aria, who Ichiko regards as the most beautiful woman she's ever met. Slowly but surely, Ichiko tries getting closer to Aria, only to find that there's far more to her, the mansion, and the Iwakura family than meets the eye. Parts of its premise sound a little familiar, right? But rest assured, it is very much original. Now, this spoiler-free review itself will be divided into two different sections, what I liked and what I didn't. Starting off with what I liked. First up, the artwork. It's nothing short of stellar. Iwakura Aria only has 15 CGs, but it makes up for it with a substantial number of cut-in, manga-like illustrations, somewhat similar to Anonymous Code's manga trigger panels, but mostly in monochrome and without speech bubbles. These illustrations are truly stunning, and in conjunction with the game's generally gothic-esque art style, they contribute substantially to giving the game an incredibly eerie atmosphere, something also aided by its gripping music. While far from the strongest soundtrack I've heard from Takashi Abo, whether he's on a hard sci-fi, a simple slice of life, or a gothic eerie game, he truly never misses. The soundtrack suits the general tone of the game very well, and speaking of sound, the game also has some top-notch voice acting, which adds a fair bit to the level of emotion you will come to feel from the story. Aside from the artwork, music, atmosphere, and voice acting, I was also a fan of the game's length. It's on the shorter side, having taken me a little under 10 hours to play from start to finish. Personally, I just prefer shorter visual novels to longer ones, so this part of the game heavily appealed to me. Unfortunately, however, that is where the positive things I have to say about this game come to an end. I have a lot of complaints. First up is the story. For a game with its premise, I found that the ultimate plot ended up being very bland, especially with the very way it proceeds past the twist midway through the story. The game leaves you with a lot of red herrings at the start, only to go in a direction that I just didn't find particularly interesting. And the general plot, while not offensively bad by any means, is far from the gripping and engaging type of story that I'm accustomed to seeing from Mages. And in terms of themes, it really didn't have all that much going for it. It explores some interesting ideas, yes, very progressive ideas for that matter, but it doesn't explore much in depth. And I didn't find it had a particularly powerful or profound message. It's certainly not a themeless story, but in my eyes, it's definitely very weak thematically. And to me, themes are the single most important part of any fictional work. Anyhow, next up among my gripes with Iwakura Aria is the game's general design. At times, it feels like it had choices and optional scenes solely for the sake of adding interactivity. And that is a trap that Mages has fallen into over and over again in a lot of their works. And unfortunately, Iwakura Aria is the same. The game features this mansion exploration mode where at different points in the story you can visit different parts of the mansion. However, only the parts of the map in red are compulsory, and the optional portions have maybe 3 or 4 lines of dialogue and add almost nothing to the story. They could have eliminated this part of the game entirely, and nothing of value would have been lost, and if they weren't to get rid of it, I would have rather they had fleshed it out to a point where the mansion exploration did have some value. But additionally, the game's branching system, while simplistic and sensical for the most part, was a little bizarre. The game features 10 different endings, most of which are quick little gruesome, bad ends, but others of which are just very abrupt, semi-happy endings. there's one character route that doesn't even last 5 minutes, and I think that they could have either removed that entirely or turned it into a proper, fleshed out route that was at least an hour long. Speaking of characters, that is another big complaint of mine. Iwakura Aria is a very character-driven story, and while that's fine, none of the characters in there are particularly compelling. And it's a little bit weird since Iwakura Aria is simultaneously both short and yet also slow. Of course, that's not inherently a bad thing, that leaves it with a lot of time dedicated to characterization, but not a lot of it comes off as particularly strong. And another thing that's very bizarre about the game's characters is that all but 3 of them don't have sprites in-game, even when they're fairly important to the story. Based on information from interviews, I suspect that this was a result of budgetary issues. Iwakura Aria was originally designed as a very short 980 yen game, which was then fleshed out and expanded into a 10-hour-long visual novel. Personally, with those budgetary considerations in mind, I would have honestly preferred if they'd have made this game voiceless and instead allocated the funds to lengthen the game and improve its production values. The cut-in illustrations in the story look very nice. I just wish that we had more of those, as well as more than 15 CGs and proper sprites for all the characters. Next up among my gripes: bugs, bugs, and bugs. And I hate that the review copy rules for Iwakura Aria indicate that I can't even show its bugginess past the first 80 minutes of the game. I honestly think that is so scummy on Mages' part. But anyhow, I haven't played the Switch version of the game, so I can't comment too much on how it fares performance-wise, but the Steam version gave me a lot of issues. In just the first chapter of the game, it crashed once every 10 minutes or so, which was extremely annoying. And I played it on an ROG Ally Z1 Extreme, which otherwise has little to no issue running most AAA games, let alone visual novels. I know of other reviewers who didn't have any problems with the port on their systems, but at least on mine, it was a buggy mess a lot of the time. The worst bug of all was at the end, where I couldn't even finish the last 2 side story chapters because of some weird bug. Even after I had finished all 10 endings and viewed the previous 4 side story chapters, I couldn't even view the last 2 for some reason. I ended up having to resort to asking another reviewer for his save file. And once I got it, it was less than a minute's worth of content to begin with. I found it to be a sloppy port all around. Fortunately, unlike the PC port of the Western release, the localization itself reads fine, although I can't comment too much on its accuracy. You may want to have a look at the Kirikiri Basara review for more details on that aspect of the localization. From what I can tell you though, I found it very odd for a game titled Iwakura Aria to localize the character's name as Aria Iwakura. Normally, I don't care much for which order names are localized in, but in this case, it felt jarring. In addition to that, there are a couple of noticeable typos, though very few and far between, a bit in the game where an entire half of a line is missing, and one odd moment in the story where the translation makes it so that someone knows the gender of a character they're only supposed to know in another ending of the story. But that just about sums up my gripes with the localization and the game itself. Overall, I found Iwakura Aria to be fairly disappointing. It's far from being offensively bad by any means, but I don't think it's particularly good either. If I had to rate it out of 10, I think I would give it a 5 or 6 at the highest. And for a game that I had been following since the day of its announcement, it truly saddens me that it turned out the way it did. Given Mages' current financial situation, making a new visual novel IP was very risky, and I commend them for taking that risk instead of just making games based off of other companies' IPs or milking the same few existing IPs they already have. I think Mages needs to make more original IP games, but nonetheless, Iwakura Aria felt to me like it was wasted potential, and as a consumer, would I recommend you buy this game? At full price, my honest answer is no. But maybe on a deep discount, it could be worth it if this is the type of story that interests you. But anyhow, that's all from me with this review. If you've already played Iwakura Aria, please let me know your thoughts on the game. Until next time, Nochiyo!